Good afternoon, everyone. I, Tina Gurnani, welcome you all to ET Telecom's webinar. To present this webinar, I welcome Mr. K.S. Rao, CEO of Telecom Services Business at Sterlite Tech. Today, he will be presenting the topic Hyperscale Network Modernization with context to fiber rollouts in India. There will be a presentation on the topic followed by a question and answer session wherein you may submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Now I request Mr. K.S. Rao to start the presentation. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for taking your time to join this webinar today. Very interesting topic, hyperscale network modernization, and when you talk about fiber rollout, so it makes it very interesting for all of us to exchange our views. I just wanted to, I think, a little bit take this time into 3-4 areas which are probably of interest for all of us. Initially, I will touch upon what's our need for hyperscale network modernization. I think it's very important to understand from what we see from the market perspective. And then we look at the challenges that we face in terms of creating this hyperscale networks. And we kind of talk about holistic approach towards making it successful, and why fiber should be only deployed by experts as a theme that we talk about this. I think most of us are aware that we, in and day out, we actually get into this kind of a discussion that in some form we are engaged with, either in the form of social networking, video streaming, or we talk about high bandwidth, low latency applications, which are augmented reality, virtual reality, autonomous driving. So all of that we know. So one thing which is interesting around this, the expanded ecosystem, which is actually requiring hyperscale, would be the scale, and then the competency at which these networks required to be built would be of a different nature, what compared to the past, as well as what is required to be built for future. Both in terms of, I think, the scale and agility, they are going to be quite different in complexity, as well as the latency requirement for most of these applications would be of different order. We know that this is something which we speak in a lot of places where if this is a reality, how should we actually look at designing networks, and what kind of, I think, complexity exists in building those future networks, and how do we need to take care of that. I think if you see that in most of these applications, you find some applications are even having very high bandwidth, as high as more than 1 Gbps, with a low latency, which is even close to 1 millisecond. So I think that kind of a complexity that we foresee in the networks that are required to be built. I think along this, I think it's beyond apps. And what I think we see that while the applications are pulling this kind of, I think, networks to be built, but the amount of, I think, devices and the usage is going to be around this will also take the bandwidth to, I think, tripling this to a zettabytes from current status. If you look at 2012 to 2020, I think what has happened in the marketplace, you find any of these things are very interesting numbers. You see that internet users have grown almost twice, and you find that almost connected devices have grown to 7x kind of numbers. And the data per consumer has really exponentially grown in the last few years, which is almost 22 times. All of this is making the networks to be of hyperscale, and actually almost demanding to create a network which can actually take care of that kind of a IP traffic in terms of tripling the zettabytes. That's a very interesting story. And I think we talk about data being the new oil, data being the new driver of the telecom growth. This is interesting to see that this kind of numbers are actually we experience in the current situation. I think what is important is all this is actually will happen with a deep fiberization, which is going to be the natural next step for this kind of networks to be built. And we all know that deep fiberization is a critical need for current networks, the way they are built and the way they're required to grow from here. Essentially, deep fiberization helps in bridging digital divide and it increasing the digital literacy. We all know about it, and also it actually improving the consumption experience of all of us, the way we use the networks going forward. And if you look at some data statistics here, I think if you compare India with some of the developed countries, which are you see that numbers are before you. The per capita consumption of a fiber in a country like us compared to developed countries, we find that its substantial focus is required in India to more and more fiberize the networks in India. If you are to really bring that experience to consumers, which actually increase the digital connectivity and also which will actually bridge the digital divide which is exists today. So that's kind of, I think, context that we have in terms of the need for a deep fiberization as a natural next step. I think it's been a journey. I think I've been in telecom for last 25 years. So I think this is something that we have seen that I believe in last 20 years, the way I think 2 million cable kilometers would have been deployed in the country. And we believe that a lot of programs in the country, both by telcos and the Indian government, BharatNet, for the next 5 years, we see almost a similar quantum of cables to be deployed. So what it actually brings a challenge is we need to deploy almost a similar quantum of network, which we could have done in last 20 years. And doing it in next 5 years is requires a different levels of skill sets and speed at which this network to be deployed. And that's kind of, I think, almost like a 5 times the speed that we need to deep fiberize the country like us. I think that's not the end of the story. I think it just started. The journey has just started, and we all know that India as a country has many challenges. I think it's a country where you create infrastructure post people start living. You create township, then infrastructure comes later. I think that journey has started, and it has a significant challenges uh, towards this path. And so, if I had to look at, if I had to summarize some of the challenges that we face from our perspective, that in creating this network, uh, or of, I think if you see that, I think this is a very common thing that we must be experiencing when we actually go and see networks, how they are built, how they are managed in the country. You find most of the pictures that you see is very common, and you sometimes you find even the cables are actually tied up to the trees, and you actually find a lot of interesting stuff around the market. So I think these are some of the unique challenges as a country we have. Uh, the trenches are very shallow. I think some of the methods which are followed for trenching are not up to best practices, and sometimes I think the once you complete the work, the manholes are not closed properly. They are kept open, and most of the time we find that all this information is not available for us to track it back and say how has been network has been built. And with this, I think unique challenges that India has today, we did a survey of I think our team did a survey about a country like us, if you are to really scale up a network which is, let's say, kind of like developing 2 million kilometers of cables in the next 5 years. What are the top 5 challenges that we foresee? I think which can actually can kind of, I think, create hurdle for this kind of network creation. And as a matter of this survey, we found that interestingly that there are five uh, challenges which came up, which as industry has viewed it very important to address. So those are actually you find them to be multiple approvals, no visibility of existing utilities as a database available for the country, and coupled with unskilled manpower doing the network deployment, and which is also added to improper survey and localized vendors. So when we did the survey, then we looked at what is our experience as a Sterlite, what we involved in this fiber network creation for last few years. We kind of categorized them into three broad categories. One is the important is initiation challenges. Before you start any project, there are some challenges which actually impedes the network creation in the country, and also there are some hidden challenges which are related to the not so right designing principles. So there are some design challenges which are there exist in this network deployment, followed by I think deployment practices and related challenges. So broadly categorize these five areas into three kind of categories, and we have understood that unless we address these areas, probably the scale at which that network to be deployed in India would not be possible. So that's something that we are looking at. These are the things. So we have a short poll now. So
We have a poll for the audience. As you can see on your screen, there's a question about how many kilometers of fiber cable has been deployed in India in the last 2 decades. You have four options. Option number one is less than 0.5 million kilometers. Option number two is 0.5 to 1.5 million kilometers. Option number three, 1.5 to 2.5 million kilometers. And option number four, more than 2.5 million kilometers. You can start typing the answers now. We're collecting responses and will be closing in next 5 to 10 seconds. We have the results with us. So 9% people have said that less than 0.5 million kilometers fiber has been deployed in India. 13% people believe that 0.5 to 1.5 million kilometers of fiber has been deployed. 61% people believe 1.5 to 2.5 million kilometers of fiber has been deployed, and 17% people believe that more than 2.5 million kilometers of fiber has been deployed in India.
So very interesting, I think, output from survey, which is close to reality. What we, I think, spoke about, that's a scale that we have built network in last 20 years. We now need to almost create a similar quantum of network in next 5 years if you really need to take this network to the next scale. That's a kind of, I think, complexities exist before industry, and all of us need to handle that. So taking from that, I think kind of a challenge, we see that I think these are the five areas that we need to focus, which is related to initiation, design, and deployment challenges. So we're going to a little bit, I'm going to talk about that, how we see that from the perspective about what challenge that we foresee, and what's impact it is actually creating to the network creation in the country, and what we as a company doing in terms of best practices which probably can help mitigating those kind of challenges. So the first, I think, in terms of any of these projects to initiate, I think it starts with, I think, approvals. As a country like India, I think this has been going on for many decades, that approvals and then bureaucracy has been one of the primary reason for the slowdown in the infrastructure creation. I think we found that from our experience that this challenge actually impacts the scale at which networks to be built significantly. From our own experience, I think some of the places that we found that multiple approvals and the agencies get involved actually delays the whole project execution because it takes almost twice the execution time. So it's a very important area to really understand and address this part. And towards, I think we know that we've been doing some level of fiberization in the country, and we are actively involved in some of the state governments to institutionalize a new set of processes which can actually address this kind of a challenge. For example, I think in one of the states that we're working, we could make this entire fiber network creation as a most vital, essential project for the citizens' experiences. Thereby, we could get that entire ROW on a blanket approval. I believe some of these practices actually can address these challenges faster than what happened in the past in terms of practices. Also, I think sometimes that SLAs are not very clearly defined who's responsible for what, and online project monitoring and a minimum touch point. So, as a company, I think we are leading the path to address this one of the important yeah, challenges that are probably required to address by all of us. So, this is something that we been able to successfully lead in some of the states, which we're going to, I think, take it to the some of the other sectors, both in state and central authorities. As a result, I think we follow that lean agile approval approach for our ROW permissions. What it essentially talks about is there is a strong requirement to leverage technology available, and both for processes as well as accessing the databases available related to the permissions, and also put the entire thing into the workflow system so that you can actually do this entire program management very effectively and deliver in a very disciplined manner. And this will result into minimum touch points and also faster deployment and accelerated readiness. So I think this is something that we follow a lean agile approval approach, and we've been very successful in some places in making the authorities, making the customer be aware of this important need of this particular change required in terms of making this entire initiation of approvals to make it simpler, make it lean, so that this actually becomes an important area to handle. The second thing that we, from our experience, we find that most of the databases that we get from approving authorities actually lacks the entire information, which results into poor database of utilities which are below the ground exist, and probably because of the improper survey techniques added to that, makes the situation very complex. For example, if you go and get a permission, sometimes we find that we actually don't know anything with what is below the ground, and you end up trying to dig make the trench, and then you find that most of the time that people actually go and cuts the which are existing utilities, and then you get into a rectification of that, and which actually slows down the whole process, and is also, I think, a huge national resources wastage of the resources. So it is important to address this challenge, which is not only impeding the project execution timeline, but also I think it is actually creating a huge disruption into the other essential utilities. Toward this, I think you find that some of these pictures, which are very common, people who have experienced in fiber rollout find this is. I was talking to one of the one of the largest fiber rollout partner for us, and I asked him, what is your most common threat or a fear that you have when you go into the field? I think most of the operators and people feel that the fear they have is that what is inside the ground actually they don't know, and end up cutting to the utilities will lead to huge disruption of services, and also it requires a lot of efforts to rectify that. That's one fear most of the industry is actually taking and then continue to work, and which slows down the pace. So I think as a taking this challenge, we have been at least started doing that. Most of the networks that we built, we started putting into GIS databases. We, as a company, leading this change, and we wanted to bring information online, and we're making sure that every network that Stellar is building, we put into a GIS database, so that actually from now onwards, whatever network we create is actually available online, and actually start becoming a repository for future. Also, I think there is a certain level of, I think, database exist in the country in a very piecemeal manner. There is, I think, a need to. We are working to get some of these databases available in a piecemeal to come to a central repository, so that actually we can make best use of the existing information that is there in the system, which can be at least to avoid, if not to eliminate, the amount of challenge that we see in dealing with the utilities below the ground. Also, we were, as a company, we're trying to introduce some of the, looking at some of the technologies that exist elsewhere, probably can be used. So we started looking at using 3D imaging radar to map the existing utilities. It actually detects to the nearest possible approximation. It may not be exactly, but we find that some of these success stories that we are doing would actually help mitigating and dealing with the challenge that is all of us are actually facing in the industry today. So I think the important thing is, in my experience, I think if the survey is everything, and if you can do this proper survey, I think your off the job is done. And I think we definitely in our system, wherever we pick up projects for execution, we have clear mandate to perform the survey in terms of 100%. Everything that we would like to at least deploy the network, we actually complete the entire survey, because this is very important aspect of the network creation. And we also partner with some of the ROW authorities for creating centralized database. This is something which is very important. I must emphasize that this is very critical for step one for creating network which will live longer, also improve the speed at which the execution can happen. We look at online digital survey platform. We have a GPS tracker movement for people, surveyors. So at least we know that survey is being done to the actual purpose, and we collect all the data of bridges, culverts, utilities, and crossings, everything online, so that there is no chances of manual errors happening around that, because we believe the starting point of collecting data has to be absolutely error free, and that's going to be important to digitalize using platforms. There are several survey platforms available for it. Also, very important to bring in some measurement tools beyond typical standard traditional methods that industry has been following so far. So we see that, I think, the modern survey technologies like LiDAR, DGPS, and 360-degree photogrammetry. So all of this can be utilized for the tools, which actually minimizes the possibility of manual interventions and leading to an improper survey, which actually leads to a kind of a lot of resource wastage while you are executing a project. And there are some, I think, important technologies available to see that online soil data evaluation techniques are available, and we adopt that. And at the end, I think we automate the whole as built preparation of the drawings, so that what we actually collect information, the entire survey of the database has been automated and is preserved, so that it is utilized throughout the network, which is during the deployment phase or during the O&M phase. So the entire information is actually available for the network where it got created. And all of this, actually, we believe it's important to bring continuous monitoring and bringing them into a central control, centrally controlled. And we started looking at this area, and we performed this as a very important step when we actually start doing the fiber rollouts. And we truly believe that this is something which is the important step for creating network faster and also make the network live longer, because you end up creating databases in digital, so that whoever wants to create a network after us actually has information online, so that there are minimum chances of, I think, the cuts, etc., the happening while somebody else is digging the ground for creating another network. The other thing that, other than the initiation challenges, the couple of areas I wanted to focus is related to design fundamentally. Uh, I think India as a country, we know that we have 1.3, 1.4 billion people, and most of the jobs that we end up doing, of course, the advantage that we have is we have a huge amount of manpower available. Uh, and in terms of, but if you don't skill them well for some of the jobs related to creation of a telecom network like this, uh, the challenge that we see is that using the unskilled manpower actually uh, impacts the productivity, and we have seen in many places that this plays a very important role on a working day. If you find that between having a skilled manpower versus if you deploy unskilled or semi-skilled manpower, you find that more than 50% of the productive hours are actually lost. And that's where I think if you really wanted to scale up the networks to a 5x pace with a limited time available to us, it's very important to address this part of the entire network, to see that we skill people who can actually utilize the most of the working window available for making the network deployment very, very productive. So towards this, we see that this is something that we, in and out, we see that unskilled manpower leads to, at times, I think non-adherence of defined SOPs is a very common practice, and which decreases the productivity. And also sometimes we find that it also raises huge safety concern the way we execute and we actually behave on field in terms of the best practices. I think towards this starlight, we are very clear that unless we actually take this larger responsibility of skilling this force, it is very difficult to get the best practices and improve the deployment speed and pace at which the networks to be built. We have created a Starlight Academy, and primarily focusing on the training of professionals to get us unskilled to a skill level. We focus on fiber network creation, and then we find that all these areas that so trenching, ducting, backfilling, blowing, all of this actually have a significant amount of skills required. Uh, I think at Starlight Academy has created, we with our experience, with our own experts on board, we also join hands with some of the equipment, which is machinery, which gets involved into network creation in the field. We collectively came back, and then we have courses for OSP, both for supervisors and operators who actually create network in the field. And in addition to that, fiber deployment certification, we also believe that the projects of this nature need to be done in a right method. So doing this project management using the right methods and tools. So we have a certification for project management methodology, which is SPMC. We have more or less, we have certified more than 2,500 people today. And we believe this is very important part that which is important for skilling the team which is involved in the deployment of the network. And this actually helps a lot in creating networks with a good quality, faster and reliable. Also, we sometimes, I think, most of the time we find that the projects that are getting deployed, especially in the fiber rollout, most of the planning is pretty manual, and the tracking happens based on what people report. And at times, I think because you have a wrong data and you have wrong soil state available, and you don't deploy right machines at the right place, you end up actually wasting the resources that get deployed, and that impedes the project pace at which we plan. So we see, I think this is a very common phenomena. We in and out, we see that people use manual planning, and which has no control. on the inputs, the activities and dependencies, and also you don't get real-time update, which actually helps you to correct problems in on time, and it sometimes it leads to incidental risk, which are because you deploy wrong machines in a different places. So I think all of this actually very important for us, and we at Sterlite uh, doing a design-led planning for this entire area to challenge to address. And this is something which is very important part which we need to we in our projects we continuously practice. Uh, the one of the aspect that we focus in this design led planning is we very much emphasize on the network design from a principle, because it's very important when you start a survey, when you do a design of a network, you need to follow an optimal path for it. And also I think sometimes is a 1+1 ring architecture, and advocate resources available during this route that you execute. And the project planning must happen through some of the planning tools. It's not manual, and we use Primavera and MS Access for planning the project, so that information can be gathered on a real-time basis. We look at analysis. We actually address some of the challenges that are there. And it's very important to map the risk before we start the work. And at times in India, we start from where we are ease at work. Then we decide to deal with most of the difficulties at a later stage. But it's a very important project like this, where you are deploying fiber across the country. It's very important to identify and map those risks and start working ahead of time, so that those do not become kind of, I think, impediments for you completing the network that you plan to deliver. All of this require a significant amount of a mind shift change from a traditional method to moving in almost into a design-led planning using tools. So also I think in addition to this, I think one of the things that India is going through, that we dig the same road many times, and we end up doing multiple times this for the same period. And when we're looking at, if you look at some of the statistics, India, I think, as a coverage, is still a long way to go in terms of fiber deployed across the road kilometers when you compare with US and China. And there's a, if you look at the digital connectivity that India is required to grow, every road must be having kind of a fiber to be deployed. I was actually looking at some of the other countries where we see that how nations have built the networks, the infrastructure, and some of the places where we find that common utility ducts have been created along the utility national highways, and as a utility corridor, which is, I believe, is one of the best design recommendation. India is trying to adopt this. India has to go a long way on it. Also, when I look at some of um, the advantages of doing this is you did once, but at a very, very significant economical cost of doing infrastructure creation for telecom. Roughly, I think all of us know that when you build a road, you end up spending anything between 4 crores to 20 crores, depending on whether you build a state highway, national highway, or express highway. But kind of, I think, uh, efforts required to dig the road again to put in telecom infrastructure, and at a cost at which it is very insignificant, at a minuscule 1-2% of the road construction cost. In fact, we can create a national telecom infrastructure for the country. So this one design recommendation that we've been working very closely, this can actually go create a network in the country in a long way, and this will be I believe this is going to be an ultimate solution for the large problem that we have in hand today. So I think that the other important challenges related to deployment is about I think the way I think we have all of us actually taken the whatever is been being done in the past, we adopt it, and then we continue to. There is a legacy of taking the practices of past without actually challenging them, which results into low productivity in terms of time and in terms of quality of network, and also ultimately total cost of ownership. And I think the challenge is all of us know that this is something that a fiber industry which is involved in creating the network of this scale need to move from a legacy kind of a daily work management to a 360-degree robust operations, which requires a significant amount of automation in processes, also training the people to who actually get involved deep into creating this network, both from a planning perspective as well as deployment and maintenance perspective. So we see that there are four areas which we at Sterlite are focusing, and we are trying to bring a change from traditional method to what ought to be the new method, and which helps this entire low productivity in the network creation gets improved using technology, using automated processes. So one of the first thing is we believe that daily operations management is something most of the times we find that in the legacy system, it's everything is depending on the people. It is all left to the individuals, and also there is no real time information. So it actually causes a lot of delays in terms of getting the problem identified and addressing it. And also the way that the industry has been set up so far, I think there is more incentives for repairs than more incentives for creating a quality and a faster network. So I think there is a method in which the networks got designed in the past, not so efficient. There is a change required in terms of challenging that, and we believe that this requires a change in terms of the operations management. We are focusing on creating standardized operating procedures, and also we kind of, I think, recognize the people who do the quality jobs well within the time. And also we are trying to challenge that if you build a network which is good in quality, designed well, if you deploy it with a good quality control, why should the network should be cut at all? And if so, is the incentive should be there or the for the repairs, or the incentives that for the no cuts of fiber? So there is a challenge. We are challenging the current the way that industry operates, and we also continues to review and see how do we improve it further. This is one area we believe is actually going to add tremendously in terms of the way networks are actually going to be built, and goes down to the people who required to manage this network creation at a ground level. Another area that we look at very significantly is that automating the processes. This is field force management system. We have looked at, I think, the way manual reporting, manual tracking has only a limited benefit, and this is very significantly we are investing. This is something that we encourage everyone building the fiber networks must invest in terms of making most of your project tracking must be through automated processes, because this is where maximum wastage of time and efforts actually gets in the country. So this is an area that we continue doing it, and we further strengthen that. Also, the other part is very important. At times, we I think don't give due importance to these areas, our partner ecosystem. I think traditionally these networks are built, and it's been almost felt that okay, fiber network can be built by having a kind of people who may not be skilled enough, may not have a requisite processes. But I think from that, I think legacy vendor management, which has not invested in terms of skills, not invested in the right tools and processes. From our standpoint of view, I think this is very important to uh, create a partner ecosystem which is equally thinking like what we are saying. Towards this, I think we have a set of approach to create a new set of, I think, wave in this kind of industry. And we have very clear empowerment criteria for partners to come on board. And we also not only get the work done, but we also train them through our Stellite Academy so that they continue to get knowledge sharing from our experiences. They go and do more jobs. The more that skills are improved, they generate better outputs. They get incentivized for getting of better productivity, and the entire team gets motivated. And we constantly look at their performance improvement through online information. We track them. we continue to see which are the areas these partners require further skilling. We provide further support from our Stellite Academy. The fourth area that very important is bringing technology into this whole space. I've been watching this whenever I visit some of the places outside India. I find that these networks are actually done using latest technology with high-speed mechanized systems available, and we find that for some reason India has not adopted these technologies. There could be several reasons for it in the past, but we at Stellite are actually challenging this, and we are working very intense in getting this some of these technologies available otherwise in some places to see if we can get them to a place like India where we can actually move from almost like a manual trenching to help putting high speed trenching machines which can actually do it 10 times faster than the normal trenching. Of course, these are required to be customized to Indian geographical conditions, but we at our technology center heavily investing into this to see that is this the next step that we need to bring in the country if you are to really focus on deploying networks of this scale that are required for next 5 to 10 years. So I think this is all put together. We believe that there is a need for an holistic approach in terms of fiber rollout in the country. It needs to be completely away from the traditional method, and it needs to be challenging the status quo. It needs to be looking at what the best practices available. Also, it needs to be more process oriented, automated technologies and high speed machine deployment in this space. So we at Stellite introducing this a lead 360-degree approach as our unique value proposition for fiber rollout networks in the country, which is very important when I look at the scale at which these networks to be built in next 5 to 10 years. I think doing same of I think more of a same would not be a result anything. And at Stellite, we are actively working around bringing this, I think, lead 360-degree approach as a unique value proposition in building this kind of hyperscale network, which is unifies both that software-defined networks from a design perspective and the scale at which 5G ready fiber network solutions are required, and doing this network deployment with most trained and experienced people, which actually creates networks which are highly scalable, and they actually live longer and then be ready, future ready for kind of application that we spoke in the beginning, and in terms of the data, etc., which is going to be from a consumer experience point of view. I think this is something which is a lead 360, lean agile approvals, everything survey, academy, training the skill side, and design led planning, and doing the 360-degree robust operation for daily work management. That's where the lead 360 for Starlight value proposition. So this is something that Starlight is bringing the value on the table. We have a poll.
Yeah.
So we have a short poll for everyone to participate, and encourage everyone to participate in this poll.
Yes, so we have another poll. Like you can see the question on your screens. The question goes, which one of the following options needs significant investments to improve fiber deployments in India? The options are technology, skill enhancement, partner ecosystem, program management, or local relationship. We will be collecting the responses now. We will be closing the poll in another 5 to 10 seconds. We have the results with us. 37% people have voted for technology, 30% people have voted for skill enhancement, 16% voted for partner ecosystem, 10% voted for program management, and 7% voted for local relationship. Over to you, Mr. Rao.
I think thank you very much. This is a very interesting poll survey. I think which is also actually goes in line with what significant focus needed in technology investments and also skilling the people, the force. And I think it's pretty interesting that I think that's what we emphasizing that if you are to lead a change in this, the way networks to be built in the coming years, Starlight Lead 360, I think, will help in a transformative approach in creating the hyperscale networks, and that's pretty interesting, which is almost close to what we internally believe the areas that we need to focus in creating hyperscale networks of this scale. Uh, so I think that's something which we also we did our own survey, and then we it's also echoes similar to what people have actually said. So our lead 360 approach actually focus on these areas which requires a significant amount of focus and enhancement to create a differentiation. So I think that I think it's very important that in terms of the networks which are required to be created are going to be very complex in nature, and defiberization is going to be a natural step for that. So the fiber networks which are going to be created today need to live longer, and they're required to really be future proofed, and that's why we strongly believe that fiber rollouts has to be done by in a very significant controlled process environment by people who are skilled, by experts who can actually design and monitor this entire network deployment using technologies and processes, because it actually very significant investment we believe our customers are doing, and which is going to create that future wave of those applications and data driving happening through these networks. So it's so important that these networks to be built absolutely with highest quality, with most reliability in terms of creating the network reliability going forward. It also helps in terms of capex optimization, reducing the opex cost, revenue uplift, faster execution of networks. All of these are going to be significant benefits. So we strongly recommend that fiber rollout should be done by experts who are skilled, and then that's how we see that this is a very critical step going forward. As a company, I think you know that we have involved very heavily in terms of creating this networks in the country. You can see some of the pictures here. We've been involved in the India's defense network in most difficult terrain in the country, which is Jammu Kashmir, for last 3 years, and it is not just easy for a company to be there for 3 years and deploy despite all the odds that are against deploying such a network in the most difficult place. But we've been able to deploy this network, and that's because of whatever that processes, tools, and deployed across this project. We're very proud of this network deployment, which is going to be one of our showcase for our fiber rollout in the country. We're also doing some difficult places in Madhya Pradesh, inside the forest, in a very dense forest. We're building a networks for creating, I think, the broadband connectivity to the people who actually really require those connectivity. And also we are involved very actively in terms of modernization of our cities, both in Gandhinagar and Kakinada. We have actively involved in deploying network both from a fiber as well as from the smart element perspective. So as a company, I think this is something that we truly believe that our capabilities, right from silicon to software, as a company, making fiber from silicon and extensive cable application engineered based designs for cable side, and bringing that lead 360-degree approach for fiber rollout, and on top add to that extent that network design build for the active side, and then we look at software to kind of improvise the network performance. I think we are in a very uniquely placed in terms of this whole thing in designing, building, and managing smart networks, and we do extensively this through see a lot of investment from a technology capability side, and we constantly engineer the networks of today, how they need to evolve for future. We constantly look at providing solutions around this network build, and that's something that is very, very unique to Stellite.
We will now be taking up questions from the attendees. The first question has come from Vinod. The question is Sterlite Tech interested in R&D for cost-effective fiber optic technology, which even a common Indian man can avail?
So thank you, Vinod, for the question. So I think most of our current research initiatives are towards making the uh, cost per GB delivered to consumer. Uh, the way that we engage in terms of both our products, fiber, cable, the way we build networks, both from a design and build perspective, the one focus is, of course, making the solutions very efficient, which can meet the network needs. But at the same time, we constantly focus in terms of how do we create a significant focus in terms of both product performance as well as network design, which can lead to a cost efficient uh, bandwidth delivered, that cost per GB delivered to end consumer. I think that has been our focus in our current research and technology initiatives, and which goes a long way, and that's been our focus.
Very well. Our next question is from Rahul Krishna Pandey. His question is which one is your most recent fiber project implemented in India? What were the most challenging factors you encountered during this project?
So there are a couple of examples. What we I think you have seen this video that which is a very large scale network, about 10,000 kilometers in the most difficult terrains in the world. Also, we have deployed some of the telco networks in a couple of states. We have done network for a cities network also. So I think all of them have a different kind of challenge. One common thing I see is that there is a significant area for opportunity for improving the skill sets of the people, right? The people actually who actually work on the ground, and if you can focus on skilling that entire team, and on top of that, we put this planning right from a traditional method to doing it in a very systematic design-led planning. I think can has resulted into significant outcome for us. So I think we have learned this from our own experiences from these 3 or 4 projects that we currently engaged with, which has resulted into creating our own. The inspiration that we got from for creating a Stellite Academy is we strongly believe that it is very important to address the skill sets of this entire force which is involved in nation building and creating this scale of a network. Uh, that's why Stellite Academy is actively involved in actually getting into the knowledge sharing and training of these people to skill the people who get involved in the network creation so that the networks are built with a good quality and faster.
Thanks for answering that question. We will be taking our last question from Mr. Amit Malik. His question is 5G deployment is mostly considered to be a wireless business. What do you think with regards to the fact that if there is not adequate fiberization to connect 5G towers, will 5G really make any difference?
I think from our perspective, I think 5G as a technology would not be successful unless there is a deep fiberization happens to the point of connect. And we see that I think both outside India and in wherever the development is happening, uh, 5G would require more dense population of fiber. Uh, there will be more small cell sites, more I think connectivity is required. So I would say that for me, I think 5G, while it is a wireless technology, but it actually requires a huge level of I think complementary support from fiber being densified the network to be created. And we have started seeing that even in the current context from 3G to 4G, we find that if the network is not fiberized enough, and we have a challenge in terms of creating a consumer experience. So I think 5G, if it is to create a different set of a consumer experience, and it needs to have lots of fiber to be deployed in connecting the backhaul network, and we already seeing that happening some places in the world, and we believe that that's going to be in time to come. India will have to grow to that level.
Thanks for answering all the questions, Mr. Rao. Unfortunately, we won't be able to take all the questions due to time constraints. If you have any other questions, please send them at editor@ettelecom.com. It was an engaging and insightful talk and hope all the participants have enjoyed the session. The recording of this webinar will be made available on ettelecom.com. Thank you everyone for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.